You should be spending 30 minutes each day on maths activities over the week. There are 3 days of tasks on this video, and you will also be set 2 mathematics activities online. Remember, you can always use Mathletics or Purple Mash for extra learning too. We're now going to think about what the words numerator and denominator mean. Have a think for a second. How would you explain to someone what the word numerator means? Now think, how would you explain what the word denominator means? The word numerator means how many equal parts you have. So you can see the pizza at the top of the screen. I've got 3 equal parts of pizza. Whereas the word denominator is how many equal parts the whole is divided into. So the pizza at the top of the screen has been divided equally into 4 parts, which is why the denominator is 4. Can you identify the numerator and the denominator in the fractions at the bottom of the screen? If you want to challenge yourself, could you think of an equivalent fraction for each of the fractions at the bottom of the screen? This is what we'll be learning about today. For your start for today, we're going to be looking at the images on the screen. For example, if you look at the stars, ask yourself, what fraction of the stars are purple and what fraction of the stars are white? We know that 2/3 of the stars are white and 1/3 of the stars are purple. Now let's look at the counters. What fraction of the counters are purple? That's right, you should have said 3/5. Now ask yourself, what fraction of the counters are white? You should have said 2/5 because there's 2 white counters, but there's 5 counters altogether. See if you can have a go at working out what fraction of the squares are purple. Now ask yourself, what fraction of the squares are white? Today we're thinking about equivalent fractions. These are all equivalent fractions, even though they all have different numerators and denominators. They show the same amount of the bar that has been shaded overall. These 3 fractions are equivalent. They have the same value. What is each fraction? Here is an example of a fraction wall. Can you identify any equivalent fractions? Equivalent fractions are fractions which represent the same value or proportion. For example, 1/2 is the same as 2/4, which is also the same as 4/8. You can make an equivalent fraction by multiplying the numerator and the denominator by the same number. For example, 2 times 2 is 4 and 1 times 2 is 2, which means 1/2 is the same as 2/4. You can also make an equivalent fraction by dividing the numerator and the denominator by the same number. The task for today is to draw a fraction wall. You then need to use this to help you identify different equivalent fractions. If you want to do the mile task, you need to complete the fraction wall and then you need to identify different fractions which are equivalent to 1/2. The spicy task is to also draw the fraction wall and then identify different fractions which are equivalent to 1/2, 1/4 and 1/6. Finally, the hot task is to draw the fraction wall, identify the fractions that are equivalent to 1/2, 1/4, and 1/6, and you need to explain your reasoning. For example, you might say 1/2 is the same as 2/4 because, and then you need to explain your reasoning behind your answer. Have fun! For your starter, you need to make up 3 maths questions about the Smarties on the screen. Make sure they link to fractions. For example, you might say, what fraction of the Smarties are red? What fraction of the Smarties are yellow? Ask yourself, what fractions can you see on the fraction rule that are equivalent to 1/2? We know that 2/4, 3/6, 4/8, and 5/10 are all equivalent to 1/2. A top tip for finding 1/2 is that the numerator is always half the denominator. You make an equivalent fraction by multiplying the numerator and the denominator by the same number. You can also make an equivalent fraction by dividing the numerator or the denominator by the same number. Here's another example. We now know that 1/3 is the same as 3/9. That means they're equivalent fractions. I've now used some bar models to represent equivalent fractions. We now know that 1/3 is also the same as 2/6, and that 1/3 is also the same as 4/12. Here are the mild questions for today. Don't worry if you can't print out the sheets, although I have sent it to your grown-ups through parent mail. You can just write the answers to your questions in your workbook. Here are the spicy questions for today. Remember, don't worry if you can't print out the sheets. You can just draw the answers in your workbook. Here are the hot questions for today. Remember, don't worry if you can't print out the sheet. You can just draw the answers in your book. Here's your quiz for today. What is 174 rounded to the nearest 10? Is it A, 170, B, 180, or C, 70? I'm sure you're getting good at Miss Charman's quizzes now. Why don't you make up 3 more questions with 3 possible answers and test someone else in your household? Have a think for a moment. How do you create an equivalent fraction? That's right. You can times the numerator and the denominator by the same number to create an equivalent fraction. You can also divide both the numerator and the denominator by the same number to create an equivalent fraction too. For example, 3/5 is the same as 6/10 because I've times both the numerator and the denominator by 2. Here's another example. Here are the mild questions for today. Don't worry if you can't print out the sheets, although I have sent it to your grown-ups through parent mail. You can just write the answers to your questions in your workbook. Here are the spicy and hot tasks for today. Have fun learning! Well done, Year 4. You finished your 4th week of maths at home. Keep up with the amazing learning, and I've really enjoyed seeing all the fabulous things you've been getting up to. Take care.